Let's talk about one of the most dramatic transformations in all of human history. We're going to cover how a small, persecuted faith grew to command empires, and how that very same power ended up tearing it apart. We're talking about a journey from being seen as criminals in the Colosseum to having kings kneeling in the snow. So let's dive right in.
So this is the central question, right? How on earth does a group that was accused of things like cannibalism and treason become an institution so powerful that it could bring emperors to their knees? I mean, how do you get from the image on the left to the image on the right? That's the incredible story we're going to unpack today.
All right, so our story starts right in the heart of the Roman Empire. And you have to understand, back then, being a Christian wasn't just a different belief system. No, it was a potential death sentence. This first part is all about survival, about enduring against the might of the world's greatest empire.
So why was Rome so hostile? Well, it was really a perfect storm of misunderstanding and fear. To the Roman elite, Jesus was, just some uneducated troublemaker. Then you had Christian beliefs that sounded truly bizarre to Roman ears. All this talk of communion, eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ, they took that literally. It sounded like cannibalism. And the fact that Christians called each other brother and sister, that got twisted into wild accusations of incest. So in the Roman mind, this wasn't a religion. It was a depraved, dangerous cult that threatened their whole way of life.
To root out these supposed criminals, Roman authorities came up with a simple but brutal loyalty test. All you had to do were three things to save your life: offer a sacrifice to the Roman gods, burn a little incense to the emperor's image, and publicly curse Jesus. For a true believer, this was an absolutely impossible choice: your life or your soul.
And for those who refused, the punishments were just horrific. Christians were whipped, fed to lions, burned at the stake. But there was a grim, twisted logic to these methods. You see, the Romans noticed that Christians faced death so calmly because they believed in the resurrection of the body. So the punishments were specifically designed to utterly destroy the body, to mock their faith and to prove that resurrection was impossible.
For centuries, this was the reality for Christians: persecution, fear, and just trying to survive. But then, on a single day, one vision before one single battle would change the course of history for the church forever.
This is the moment. It's October 312 AD. The Roman general Constantine is about to face his rival for control of the empire. The thing is, he's massively outnumbered. Defeat seems almost certain. But on the eve of the battle, he looks up to the sky and sees a vision. The very next day, his small army pulls off a stunning, totally impossible victory. And just like that, Constantine becomes the sole emperor of Rome.
And this is what he supposedly saw: a fiery cross in the sky, with these words emblazoned on it: "By this sign you will conquer." It was a divine promise, tying military victory directly to the Christian God. Just think about that. The cross, once a symbol of a criminal's execution, was about to become a symbol of imperial power.
But here's a fascinating little twist that historians just love to debate. For all this divine intervention, Constantine, the first Christian emperor, waited until he was literally on his deathbed to get baptized. This makes a lot of people question his motives. Was his conversion a genuine act of faith, or was it a brilliant political move to unify a fractured empire under a new banner? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Okay, so with the emperor on their side, the church's survival was finally secure. But as it turns out, its greatest challenges were now going to come from within. This next chapter is all about how one unified faith fractured into two.
For centuries, this divide had been slowly growing between the two main centers of the church. You had Latin-speaking Rome in the west and Greek-speaking Constantinople in the east. They spoke different languages, sure, but they also clashed over some really fundamental theology, like the very nature of Jesus. And then there was politics. As the Western empires started to crumble under invasions, they felt totally abandoned by the East. Meanwhile, the East grew more and more suspicious of Rome's claim to have the final say on everything.
Well, all that tension finally boiled over in the year 1054. In a major power move, Pope Leo IX sent a representative to excommunicate the head of the Eastern Church, basically to kick him out of the faith. In a dramatic response, the Eastern Patriarch marched into the Grand Cathedral of Hagia Sophia and excommunicated the Pope right back. And with that, the split was permanent. The one Christian church was now two: Roman Catholic in the West and Eastern Orthodox in the East.
Now, with its Eastern rival pretty much out of the picture, the Roman Church in the West entered an era of absolutely unprecedented power. And this led to a whole new set of conflicts, not with outsiders,
but with the very kings and emperors of Europe.
So, how did the Pope justify this supreme authority? With a really clever and powerful idea called the two-sword theory. The logic went something like this. God gave the Pope two swords. One sword represents spiritual power, which of course the Church controls. The other sword represents worldly or secular power, which is given to kings. But, and this is the really crucial part, kings can only use their sword with the Pope's permission. In short, the Pope was everyone's ultimate boss.
And to understand the sheer scale of this papal power, you really only need to remember one number. Just one. 3.
3. That is how many days the most powerful man in Europe, Emperor Henry IV, stood barefoot in the freezing snow, begging for the Pope's forgiveness. After he was excommunicated, he was forced to humiliate himself outside the Pope's castle. This image became legendary. It was the ultimate proof that even an emperor served at the pleasure of the Pope.
This immense power was, of course, matched by immense wealth, and a lot of it was gathered through some pretty controversial means. You could literally buy a powerful church office, that was a practice called simony, or you could buy something called an indulgence to reduce your time in purgatory after you died. You combine that with church taxes and massive donations, and money just poured into Rome, making the papacy one of the wealthiest institutions on earth. Well, this combination of power and wealth led to widespread corruption and, you guessed it, a lot of public cynicism. There was a popular saying from the time that just captures the mood perfectly. If you believe a bishop can be saved, there's nothing left in the world you can't believe. People saw the clergy as so worldly and corrupt that the idea of one getting into heaven was basically a joke.
But even as the church's leadership became more and more corrupt, a powerful counter-movement was growing from within. And this is the final chapter of our story, a passionate call to return to the church's spiritual roots.
By this point, the spiritual life for many believers just felt hollow. Your local priest was often uneducated and pretty uninspired. Their sermons were like listening to someone read from a textbook, totally monotone, formal, and completely disconnected from the lives of everyday people. There was this deep spiritual hunger that the official church was just failing to satisfy.
And into this spiritual void stepped a whole wave of new religious orders. We're talking about groups like the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and others. They offered a radical alternative to the wealthy, power-hungry church establishment, and their approach was completely different.
I mean, they were the total opposite of the establishment. Instead of seeking wealth, they took vows of radical poverty. Instead of hiding away in fancy cathedrals, they walked among the poor. And instead of giving those boring, monotone sermons, they preached with a raw passion that just captivated people. They offered a vision of faith that felt authentic, vibrant, and, well, real.
So we end with this. The story of the church reveals this constant tension, this push and pull between power and piety, between wealth and faith. These new orders were a powerful attempt to reform the church from the inside, but it leaves us with a timeless question, one that's still relevant today. When a great institution becomes corrupt, can it actually be saved from within? Or is a more radical, complete break inevitable?